to just sort of go crazy with it because most people that listen are Dynasty. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 20 of the Snake in the Draft podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vines. You can find me on Twitter at jsnake_DFF. In this episode, I have Andrew Hall coming on the podcast. You should follow Andrew on Twitter at AndrewHallFF. He is a fantasy contributor for PFN and focuses on their dynasty. He focuses on their dynasty material. Today, we're going to talk about redraft strategy from the draft to the championship. Welcome, Andrew. How are you doing?
Doing great, Jake. Looking forward to talking to you.
I know, yeah. Excited to talk some redraft because this will actually be the first redraft podcast of this podcast. And I think the strategy is something a lot of people don't think about because we always think, oh, who's the best player to choose? But there is still that strategy of like, do I go, quote, 0 RB or 0 wide receiver or whatever? So I'm happy to dig in.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to it.
So one question I ask every guest is, what is one hobby that you really enjoy doing that does not relate to fantasy football?
All right. Well, I got to be honest. You sent me this question earlier, and I had to ask my wife. I'm like, all right, hang on. What would you say is my one hobby outside? Because fantasy football takes up about 80% of my hobby time, right? Like I'm contributing, I'm writing, I'm doing these podcasts and stuff. Like I'm running the PFN Dynasty Twitter. Like I'm doing a lot of stuff. And she was like, well, I guess outside of fantasy, it'd be yard work. And I 100% agree. I love getting on the lawnmower and not, it's a push mower, but I love getting on the yard and just kind of like helping the earth and like moving things around and weed whacking and all that. So I think that's probably my number one hobby outside of fantasy is, yard work. Good time for listening to podcasts too.
Yeah, for sure. What's your preferred times? I know a lot of people are early morning, but then some people like it more later. What's your preferred time for yard work?
Well, I like to let the dew kind of come off the grass a little. So I prefer that like 11 to 3 right in the heat of the day. I don't mind that it's super hot. I'm also super allergic to a ton of different bugs and trees and everything else. So I end up mowing no matter what temperature it is. I mow in long sleeves and long pants, which just looks crazy. So I'm just out there sweating. It's a workout and I love it.
Awesome. At least you don't have to deal with getting sunburn or anything.
That's
as long
true.
As you have like a hat on.
That's true. Yep.
Awesome. So with this podcast, we're going to be talking about redraft strategy, and we're going to talk about what to do pre-draft, what to do during the draft, what to do in season, and then any type of strategies going into the playoffs. So we'll start with the pre-draft. So before we dig into anything too in-depth, are there any interesting wrinkles you like to add to your redraft leagues? Like some additional examples are adding in a super flex or changing the scoring around.
Yeah, so I used to be, I've been playing fantasy for almost 20 years now, and I used to be redraft only. I think like everybody in Dynasty, nobody starts in Dynasty, right? We all start in redraft and kind of work our way in. And I know some of the leagues that I was in, all of them had their own thing, and I was never a commissioner. I was always just a last guy ad, like, hey, we're looking for one more. Oh, all right, sure. I think if I were to look back on that, I would say PPR is definitely better. I prefer it more. It adds a little bit more dynamics in the scoring. I also now, after being in Dynasty and in some Dynasty Superflex leagues, I definitely prefer Superflex. I like tight end premium. I don't like where you have to start 2 tight ends, but I like where tight ends get a little boost. So some of those kind of things I like. And in redraft, that really does throw a wrench in the mix, or at least it can, because in Dynasty, some of that stuff, you think about it so long in Dynasty, and in redraft, your draft comes up, you draft and you play. It's just like you just go. So some of that stuff can make it even more, exciting in the season if you're not really paying full attention all year. And so I guess that's kind of it, is just hitting on what your examples even were, just the scoring and Superflex. I like that additional weight that you give to the other positions.
Yeah, and I think that's why we all enjoyed Scott Fishbowl so much. And I know he threw a big old wrinkle with the QB scoring and how that it was where if a quarterback had below 66% of passes completed, they started getting negative points. So QBs like Jameis Winston got a huge hit from stuff like that. And I do agree. I actually used to be really, really, really pro start 2 tight end, and then I've started looking into it and had some discussions on Twitter. And I've definitely leaned closer towards that larger boost in that tight end premium. Like I go half and half with half PPR and PPR, because for me it's tough because PPR is more fun because you have those running backs that can actually produce. Like you have the James White who can be an RB2, and you can use that sort of game theory that way, versus half PPR. Then he's sort of that guy that you're like, he'll produce, but he'll still probably just be an RB3.
Yeah, and you're exactly right there too. There's some of those guys that in PPR are valuable that are in standard or non-PPR, however you want to word that, aren't as valuable. I do like half PPR. I don't mind that, especially if you're in a league with some guys that just won't do full PPR. They just, for whatever reason, they hate it. That's not how their granddad played fantasy football or whatever. That's not how they play the real game. all those kind of people. So I like half PPR as kind of a mediator. Like, all right, we'll just give it a little bit of a boost. Because I do think that balances out running backs and receivers a little bit more. I think it adds a lot more value to the slot receivers, guys like Cooper Kupp, Jameson Crowder, whatever, those guys that you normally wouldn't necessarily care too much about, right? They might get 9 catches for 38 yards and a touchdown. In a standard league, that's 9 points. But in a PPR, that's 15 or 18 points. I mean, it gets them right up there with everyone else. And those catches count. Something I would like to see done more kind of on that next level would be point per first down. I'm only in 1 or 2 leagues that do that, but I think that should be something we get more to as a I don't know, as a platform or as an industry. I just think point per first down is much more meaningful. Those first downs are huge. And so if you start rewarding guys that get first downs, that's important on the field. That's what we're going for. So I would love to see something like that happen more. It's not really taken off yet. I think PPR is just getting there, but point per first down should be the next one on the list.
Yeah, I agree with that. I added it to my most recent Dynasty League I commissioned. I think that it's one thing that just helps, like you said, the important plays, the players get the points for it. And one example related to Scott Fishbowl was Sony Michel, and how he, in like any format except for standard or non-PPR, is really just useless, honestly. So I think is it a full point for Scott Fishbowl? Is that right?
I think so, yeah. I think so.
Okay. So full point, and so Sony Michel was getting the first downs more often than not, and that gave him more of an advantage and made it to where, I mean, you could throw in Damian Harris. Now, whoever the running back becomes, the main running back for New England, has that nice floor set because they're going to get the first downs. And then another example is like the tight ends. Kelsey, Kittle, all those tight ends that get used for those first down plays, they're even more valuable, which to me, we're going to talk about this, but I really like going tight end early, and I think that that's a nice way to set yourself apart. And then also you don't have to deal with the streaming the tight end, that awfulness, because last year I was lucky. I had Kelsey in 2 out of my 3 redraft leagues, and it was just fantastic because you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to drop decent running backs to get a tight end that you're like, oh, hopefully he gets a couple points here or there.
Yeah, no, and you're exactly right. And just to clarify, SFBX is half point, but it's 1 point for tight end. So it does give a boost of full PPR for tight end. So, but I mean, you're exactly right though. I mean, some of that stuff with the tight end, especially, I mean, you want to get one of those studs and not have to worry about your lineup. That's the way to do it. I think something that gets overlooked a lot in Dynasty is that week-to-week management kind of gets, I don't want to say ignored, but it gets pushed to the back. And in redraft, that's all there is. So in redraft, especially, not having to worry about setting your lineup is ideal, right? When you wake up on Sunday and you've got your 8 starting guys and they're your 8 starting guys, other than bye weeks, of course, but like that's the best feeling. You don't have to worry, do I start X or Y? Do I play this guy or this guy in my flex? Like, no, it's just you set it and forget it. Those are the easiest leagues. I love those kind of teams.
Yeah, we'll get into the QB discussion as well, because that gets an interesting discussion because almost everybody's QB late, which can provide an opportunity to get a really, really solid QB like a Mahomes or Lamar Jackson at a decent price. But we're going to start talking about the draft. Do you have any specific strategy this year in your redraft leagues?
Yeah, so the one redraft league that I'm, other than Scott Fishbowl, the one that I pay attention to is my home keeper league that I've been in for, 16, 18 years. It kind of blurs together. But in that league, we get one keeper, and it's the round you drafted them at, and you can't keep them a second year. So everybody's got their own specific thing. But the keeper I've got is Godwin in the 5th. So that means my first 4 rounds are open for picks, and everybody gets one keeper. So you've got some running backs off the board. But my general theory in any redraft league, and I've even done a couple other ones, is try to hammer that running back room early. In Dynasty, we all like to look at, in startup drafts especially, we all like to look at receivers because they hold value longer. And it makes sense. You can get a rookie running back in the next year's rookie draft that hits the ground running, pun intended, that kind of lets you gain that value right away. Receivers take a little while to get there. So in redraft, it's flipped. In redraft, running backs are so much more important. Running backs will almost always be the reason you win or lose your league. And from what I've experienced anyway, the years that I do well, my running backs don't get hurt, and I've got plenty of them to play in my flex. The years where I don't, like where I have a bad time and I'm just not doing well at all, is when either a running back goes down or I drafted receiver. Those are usually the years that I just don't feel like I'm having a good time, especially in non-PPR. So yeah, for this year in my redraft league that I'm drafting next week, actually, I'm planning on going pretty as we say, RB robust, right? Like running back robust. Let's get all those running backs I can, take whatever values are there, and just try to ride that late round receiver value later on in the draft.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think RB heavy is the way to go if you can. There is a certain point where like a Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams has value. I'd say probably around like 1.08, 1.09-ish. And I wouldn't be surprised this year with how much everybody is, including both of us saying go RB heavy, but you still have to look at those values and think, okay, where is that difference? And it's tough because then like I'm going to talk about how I would take Travis Kelce in the middle of the second as well as Kittle. And with that, if I could get a running back at like 1.06, like a Derrick Henry, even in a PPR league, somewhere probably, yeah, Henry, maybe Clyde Edwards-Helaire, that they're pretty similar. I think PPR would go towards Clyde Edwards-Helaire, half PPR Derrick Henry. But just getting the running back and then a tight end, and then the third round, you'll probably find that you could potentially get Leonard Fournette, who everybody has their own feelings. They're either really strong against and really strong for, and I lean more strong for just related to the potential production and upside. But then again, you could also just get a receiver. Or, like we're going to talk about next, you could maybe get Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson. So what round and pick would you select Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson in a 1 QB redraft league?
Sure, and this is a question actually I think we all get on Twitter from people that are kind of coming back into this and are curious because they really want the best QB. Everybody loves that shiny new toy, and Pat Mahomes is obviously a stud. He's almost definitely going to be in the top 3 quarterbacks at the end of the year, barring injury. His value isn't going to change, so it's not like you're really risking a lot drafting him. I personally don't like taking a quarterback until the 3rd or 4th round in a 1 QB league. That's just the way I am. There is a lot of value to me later on in quarterbacks, and there are even a lot of redraft leagues that I end up streaming because the guy you take in the 15th round isn't great, and then a guy shows up out of nowhere. But for reference, in a redraft league that I just did, I had the 106. I took Dalvin Cook, Tyreek Hill, Derrick Henry, Chris Godwin, Patrick Mahomes. And so at that point, I'm looking at it where Derrick Henry obviously like is a stud. Chris Godwin is a stud. Mahomes is a stud. And in that 3rd round range, there are guys going there in this league anyway. Right after that was Carson, Fournette, Amari Cooper, Ridley. I'm just not wowed by a lot of those guys. So for me, there's a teardrop where the running backs are kind of gone. The wide receiver ones are kind of gone. And there's that kind of dead zone in that 3rd, 4th round. If Mahomes and Jackson are both there, obviously I'm going to pick Mahomes over myself, but I get the value in both. But I just feel like that's where I would start looking at it, depending on how the draft falls. If there's a value still there, I'm willing to pass and see what I can find later. But yeah, that's about as early as I'm going to go. I'm not earlier than that.
Yep, I completely agree. Like mid to late 3rd, there is that awkward period, like you mentioned, or you're just looking at everybody and you're like, ugh, this is just it's like, yeah, it's like right at the middle to end of the 3rd, and it just gets a little ugly. And you have it to where, like you said, Amari Cooper, Leonard Fournette, they're not guys that you're like super pumped about. I think they'll still produce well, and probably by the end of the year, Fournette will be probably at least a high end RB2. Amari Cooper will be probably a low end wide receiver 1, but at the same time, you do deal with like consistency for Amari Cooper. Yeah, and there's also always that chance that like one of those top 6 or so QBs are just going to fall. Like last year, there was a couple leagues that I drafted Russell Wilson in like the 10th round because he just kept falling because everybody was scared about that consistency and what he was going to do. And it worked out great because he killed it. He did fantastic last year. And it's always that like, who's that late round QB you want? And I'd say for me, probably one of my top choices is going to be someone like a Jared Goff, especially if it's a 6-point per touchdown league. I think he's going to play really well. Do you have someone you're looking at, Andrew, as a late round QB?
Sure. I mean, one of the ones that I've been, I don't know, landing on in mocks or coming around to on redrafts that I've done just for this year. And I think it's because of the fact that I'm in Dynasty maybe, but Drew Brees is someone that is still there in almost every draft in the 12th or 13th round. Everybody feels like it's his last year and he's kind of washed up. In redraft, that doesn't matter. In redraft, he's still Drew Brees. In redraft, he's still as accurate as anybody else and is throwing to what could be considered the number 1 receiver in all of football, Michael Thomas. You know, if you're thinking Thomas is a number 1 or 1st round, number 1 overall wide receiver, why isn't Drew Brees up there? What, he doesn't have a number 2? You think Emmanuel Sanders isn't going to catch the ball? Jared Cook, you got him, Alvin Kamara. I mean, he's got so many weapons just like always. But in Dynasty, we're all fading the aging quarterback. So I think a lot of Dynasty players are fine to pass on Drew Brees. I will add this caveat, though. In home leagues, that's different. And people that don't play fantasy that much or only in one league and pick up the draft guide on the way to the draft, right? Those guys, you're going to see Brees go in the 3rd. And you're just going to sit there and go, wow, okay, like that's a little early, but that's how they feel is they want to get that stud guy. And to them, Drew Brees is that stud. So I always say this, and this is a perfect time to bring it up. You got to play your room more than anything else in redraft, especially because we all know our redraft leagues better than anyone else. Even if it's a random redraft league, if you join a league from PFN, we're starting some. I know that there's a bunch of others out there, like through Safe Leagues, or even just people on Twitter getting together. These are almost always going to be fans of fantasy that are joining those leagues. So they're going to be a little bit more in the know. They're going to be a little bit more aware and understanding rankings and all that. But if you're playing in a home league with your cousin Dale and your nephew John and your coworker Jim, and these guys don't pay attention, you're going to see some crazy values, and there's no reason to reach. Always react. And I always say that, and I know everybody says that, but be liquid in your draft, be fluid, let the draft come to you. And that's the easiest way to do that, is just sort of play the room, know your room, know the guys you're going against, and you can get guys late at terrific value because they're passing on AJ Brown, because that's a running offense. AJ Brown won't get the ball. I'll take him into 6, sure. You know what I mean? Like that's going to happen in every redraft league. So that's a really big piece of advice, I think, that goes along with QB picking. Because if you see your guys waiting and nobody's taking a QB, then you don't need to go with QB either, right? Don't force it. Don't say, hey, it's the 3rd round, it's time to take Mahomes. Check and see if there have been some crazies already. If there's been some weird things, let's hold off. I'd rather have the value at other positions if I can get it. That's pretty much the gist.
Yeah, I agree. I always come into my redraft leagues having sort of like a nice little breakdown on who I want pick by pick, especially if I know what draft pick I have, because the quick drafts they go by quick. And it's always that panic, especially if you're between 2 players and you're like, oh gosh, okay, I can either have Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs. Who do I want? Oh man, okay, Joe Mixon, he has a offense up and up. He has a rookie. I don't know. Josh Jacobs may not get the passing work. I don't know. And yeah, I just sort of have that plan. I think using some type of rankings as like a rough way to look at it is always helpful. Like I know the footballers, their draft kit's fantastic. I've looked at it a couple of times and it's really well done. And I think even like Fantasy Pros, just looking at that, nice and simple. PFN probably has something as well that you can look at. Yep. So yeah, just sort of getting something to help rank it and like tier it yourself is probably one of the better ideas as well. And yeah, it's the tiers is going to be the really important part, because that's whenever you look at it in that dead space is when you have multiple tier gaps. Like that's what's happening there. You just have multiple tier gaps. You have Leonard Fournette, probably the start of the tier. Amari Cooper, start of a tier. But real quick, Andrew, do you have any other preferred late round running back, wide receiver, tight ends that you like to draft?
Yeah, and I just want to dovetail on what you just said. That's a perfect way to put it. Just real quick. Take a ranking that you trust and then draw your own line where there are tiers. That's pretty much what I always say. Even if you get a book, pick a line and say, here's where I think there's a big difference. And that way, when you're in your draft, you can see if it's the last guy in a tier or the first guy in a tier, and that can help break a tie. If it's the last guy in a tier, you should take him because that tier drop is coming. If it's the first guy in a tier, you've told yourself before you're in the emotional moment, I can wait. These guys are all close enough. I'll wait on running back and take the last guy in the receiver tier. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that because that's a huge piece of advice that I think a lot of people miss on. I don't mind taking other people's tiers, but I'd rather you yourself read through it real quick, take 5 minutes, pick a ranking sheet because they're all kind of the same. PFN's got one, obviously, for redraft on our site, and I think you should take that, print it out, and draw a line, right? Whatever you got to do, because that'll help. But back to your question, late round running backs. There are some late round guys I think that can have huge value. One of the guys actually just did a mock this week, and some of the late round guys I like, and that would Josh Kelly, obviously for the Los Angeles Chargers. He's a rookie. There's no guarantee that he's going to get work, but rookie running backs and redraft are always somebody I target late in drafts because you just never know. You just don't know how the guys in front of them are going to perform. You don't know what injuries are going to happen. So I always love late round running backs like that with rookies. And then another one I like is Duke Johnson, who kind of gets ignored. He's the other D Johnson in Houston now. But David Johnson, while he's a stud and is worthy of a RB2 flex kind of pick, there's a very high likelihood that Duke Johnson gets almost as many carries or as many touches per game. I just don't know we don't know. Nobody knows how that's going to split yet. So there's a very high likelihood that you could take Duke Johnson with your 14th round pick, and he ends up being your weekly flex start. So those are two guys I'm trying to target late in drafts, among many others, but those are two that I like to call out. What do you think about those two?
Yeah, I like it. I think they're both really solid picks. One thing I didn't realize, I have Fantasy Pros ADP up, and Justin Jackson, who most people, if they play Dynasty, they are more high on Joshua Kelly, and so they're going to pick him above Justin Jackson. But like you've already mentioned, most people are just normal people. They're not crazy like us on Twitter all the time, really digging deep and trying to find that next up-and-coming guy, but they're different by like 70 picks. Joshua Kelly is going to be undrafted. So yeah, he's a fantastic 15th round guy to just go ahead and get, because you want like your 15th and your 14th round people. Like we're going to talk about defenses a little bit in just a sec, but you want those high end running backs that have potential. Like Chase Edmonds is on here too. Like I'd even throw in Boston Scott. Damian Harris,
Damian
sort of.
Harris. Yeah, I think Damian
Yeah,
Harris, like Jinx, right? Like I love Michael Keaton, but at the same time, Damian Harris, I'm telling you, is the same situation. Sony Michel is proven to be a little bit inconsistent and injury prone. And even though you've got James White, you might have Rex Burkhead, you're still going to need to give the ball to somebody, especially with Cam Newton behind that offense now. I think Damian Harris is another terrific late round value that you can get almost for free. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
yeah. A couple that I would mention as well is like Zach Moss has been all the talk of Twitter recently, but I think if you're in your home league, he can be a decent guy you can get in the 10th or the 11th round, and I like him better than Devin Singletary just related to ADP difference. And for me, in half PPR, he's more valuable than full because I know he has some catching upside, but I think the real benefit for Zach Moss is the touchdowns.
Yeah, and you're exactly right too. Everybody in Dynasty is talking about Zach Moss, including some of the Ball Blast girls. Right, they've kind of gone all in and really ramped up his ADP, which I'm entirely fine with because I'm not a huge fan. And so what ends up happening with players like that, I don't say I'm out on anyone. It's always about value. It's about cost. But at his current cost, I'm probably going to miss him. Like there's probably going to be somebody that takes him in the 8th because they've heard about him or they think the Devlin Singletary is not that great. I'm fine getting him if I can get him in the 10th, 11th, 12th kind of range. I think you're exactly right. He's got a lot of upside. And to go back on that other point, that's what you're looking for on your bench. You're not looking for guys that will get you 3 to 5 points. Those are on the waivers. You're looking for guys that get you either 0 or 20. You want somebody that's got that boom potential, even if you don't start them that week. They've now got instant value on your team for trades, right? That's when you start using guys like that for a 2-for-1 trade in redraft. And it happens every year. I do it every year in my home league where somebody's looking for depth. They feel like they don't have depth. Somebody got hurt. And I say, hey, I'll trade you Zach Moss and Calvin Ridley for Devontae Adams. And they go, you know what? That's not bad. Zach Moss has showed, look at that. He just got 20 points in week 1. He's going to be a stud. That's easy. You're an idiot for making that trade. And I'm like, I just got Devontae Adams for a steal. You know what I mean? I don't need Zach Moss. I don't necessarily need that depth right now. I'll take that in package together. So to kind of, again, to go into that with some other redraft talk, it depends on your league. Some leagues don't do trades. Some guys are real conservative. But that's the reason you want those upside guys later is because you want to hit that value. And on the other end, if they get 0, if Zach Moss gets you 0 in week 1, you want to be able to drop him and say, all right, I don't need Zach Moss. I want to pick up the flavor of the week that did get 20. I want to go and put a waiver claim in or spend all my fab or whatever. And I don't want to have to worry about dropping potentially a backup or Damian Williams or whoever, like who obviously isn't playing this year, but someone like that who could become the starter, someone who is a potential good value for your team. So that's kind of where I'm at, is that Zach Moss is a prime candidate for that. He may not do anything week 1. You can drop him and pick him up again in week 3, right? I mean, why not? But you'll see a lot in the early, and that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, always be fluid early on. Don't get take locked. Don't think that you know more than everybody else because, as we've already mentioned, we're all just guessing. And those 2-for-1 trades are really great. And that's actually where the Jake the Snake nickname came from. I traded away in 2018 in a work league. I traded away AJ Green the week before he got hurt and Nick Chubb for Zeke. And
nice.
Yeah, it was that 2-for-1. It worked great. My team was stacked. Didn't end up winning the league. I won this last year. But yeah, it's those 2-to-1s are the great way because people think, oh, depth is so important in redraft. No, you want to be as top heavy as possible, and then you stream the other positions and you just figure out who's going to be in your flex because in Dynasty, you sort of want some depth because you don't know when injuries are going to hit. And you can't pick people up. Redraft, there's so many people on the waiver wire that you can get anybody at any time. And a couple of other players that I really like is some depth pieces. Now, they're not really super high upside potential, but they're wide receivers that I think can provide some nice floor depth. And we already mentioned one, Jamison Crowder for PPR. He's just going to get passes. No one can stay healthy for the Jets. Same with the 49ers. Everybody, those two receiver groups are just getting destroyed. So Jameson Crowder's someone I like as a late round guy that you can pick. And maybe you really went like you got 4 top end running backs, then he can help sort of pick up the slack if one of your receivers start to struggle. Like AJ Brown, I could see him being a little bit more boom or bust, and maybe he plays a tough team like, I don't know his schedule exactly, but the Ravens, and struggles. Well, then you put Jameson Crowder in there just as a helpful person. And this last one is Randall Cobb, and he's someone in most redraft leagues I would just leave on the waiver wire because most redraft leagues are just 15 rounds. But if you have a deeper one that's like 20 rounds or even like a best ball or anything like that, Randall Cobb is someone I can see have a massive value increase as the season goes on. Brandon Cooks, concussion issues, Will Fuller, hamstring issues, and all it takes is one of them dropping off. And then Randall Cobb can be similar to Jameson Crowder with getting a ton of the receptions and be a nice PPR. And both of these are PPR, I should say. They're not those boomer bust. I'd probably pick Mecole Hardman over them in like a non-PPR league.
Well, and I'll just add to this too. I think you're exactly right. There is a need for floor. I don't want to make it sound like we're against floor players. I just like to target upside guys later in the draft, running back or receiver, either one. But something I try to tell people anytime I'm giving one-on-one advice or anytime I'm talking to anybody specific about their league, I always say, well, how risky are the other guys in your league? Right? Are a lot of the guys in your league looking for that high upside and are only taking risky guys? Because what ends up happening, and I've seen this in so many redraft leagues and starting to see it in Dynasty too, is that guys will draft all risky players and all ceiling players and not have anybody floor. And so their consistency week to week goes out the door. They might score 120 one week and then 35 the next. You can't win a championship that way. You have to have balance. And something I say, and I mentioned it and I don't even know how many articles, but if you're taking risky players early, you want to get floor players late and vice versa, right? So if you're taking someone like Tyreek Hill, in my mind, is a little bit of a risky player, right? He's got a lot of upside. He's got a ton of potential for 30 points, but that defense could shut him down. They could double team him and Kelsey goes off that week. Well, that's somebody that's a little bit risky to me. So if I'm taking Tyreek Hill early, then I'm fine to go with somebody like Jamison Crowder as my wide receiver 3 or flex, because I know I'm going to catch up some of that floor and I'm going to average my level out a little bit. I know something that ESPN likes to do, and I think they did this even during their marathon or whatever, is they always talk about how many points each position on the roster is going to get you, right? And so if you're looking at your wide receiver 1, you need to get, like 15 points in standard from them or something like this, right? And the logic is very sound because you want to make sure you've got enough points to get to the above average spot for your league. And so that's why I go back to this and I say, again, if everyone else in your league is drafting ceiling players and they're all taking risks ahead of you and they're reaching for guys that are ceiling plays, may not be a bad idea for you to grab the floor guys and just walk through the season and say, all right, fine, I'm going to take all the floor. I'll score 90 a week, but I'm going to win 6 of the 6 and 7. I'm going to get to the playoffs. And that's when you need consistencies in the playoffs, right? So to kind of even go back even further, taking upside guys and trading them for 2-for-1s, getting the stud. I do that a lot early in the year. And then I kind of do the opposite later when I'm looking for depth, when I need that for the playoffs. So it's never a fluid, it's always a fluid process. It's never a static advice. And that's why I always say, too, your context in your league matters so much. If your league is a very conservative league where nobody trades and everybody's looking at floor and you see your receiver values dropping, then hell, be risky. Go get them all, right? Like that's kind of the idea is you got to zig when everyone else zags in your league. But there's no way anyone on Twitter could tell you that by a question that you post or a poll. Who do I take, Tyreek Hill or someone? You're like, no one, you can't add that context unless somebody asks. So I always say that to people too, is that know your league, know your settings, know how your league is run year to year. If it's a first year, do your best. But yeah, guys like Crowder and Cobb, those are perfect picks for later on or even off the waivers if you feel like you need a little bit of more balance for your team. I love it.
Yep, I agree. And I think sort of going off a redraft to dynasty, a lot of people in, say, rounds 11 and further on in like superflex drafts, they draft all the rookies instead of looking at the Jamison Crowders, the Marvin Jones and stuff like that to give you that more the safety and can actually help you win year one versus just being all upside potential. And honestly, rookies, like, they do bust. I think 2020 may have a higher, or the 2020 draft may have a higher hit rate, but still, like I've talked about it with, I think it was last podcast with John Hogue, that it's still going to be at least a 25% bust rate. And there's going to be players we don't expect to bust that are going to bust. And it's going to suck because everybody's been so hyped and we all get in our own little echo chamber of Twitter and how we all think the rookie's going to immediately step in and dominate. But like with Joshua Kelly versus Justin Jackson, a lot of people thought, Joshua Kelly would get the job. And I'm not going to say he can't get the job, but we just need to look at that as like a dynasty community and be like, okay, the player with the team, like even Darrell Williams versus DeAndre Washington, the player that's been with the team, I think should just get the leg up right off the bat. And it's tough because, you want the next up and coming guy. You want the guy that's just going to dominate. But anyways, get off my soapbox. Next question is about starting when you're going to pick a defense. So what round would you look to add one? And another discussion I want to have as well is it was actually the Fantasy Footballers had a article that was written about looking at opening schedules. And I know schedules aren't perfect yet, but sort of looking at opening schedules, and a couple of those teams are like the Indianapolis Colts, who face Jacksonville, Minnesota, and the Jets for the first 3 weeks. You have the Cleveland Browns, which is Baltimore, which that one's a little bit tough, but then they face Cincinnati and the Washington Football Team, and then the Eagles, who face Washington, the Rams, and then the Bengals. So what do you do with your defenses?
Well, okay, so in a normal redraft league where you're not keeping anyone and there's no penalty or bonus or whatever, it's always my last pick. If you have a kicker and a defense, they're always my last 2 picks, right? And in some leagues, I've told this to people over and over again. If you don't have to draft one, don't draft one. I'd much rather draft Josh Kelly, right? Joshua Kelly for the Chargers than a defense and have no defense on my roster leaving the draft. right? Because almost always your drafts are at least a couple of days to a week to 3 weeks before the season. Now we're getting close, right? And the season has been kind of up in the air. So a lot of people push their drafts back to this weekend or next weekend and all this. So in that point, there's only a shorter window. But I still say if you don't have to draft a defense or kicker, don't bother. You can stream the position really easily. That's my logic. So if I'm looking at a defense, if I'm drafting one at all, like in my home league, I have to draft one. I love Philadelphia. That's one of my targets every single year, just because they end up playing the Cowboys, which means they end up getting a lot of potential for points, because that is a heated battle, and they like to, obviously turnovers and all that. Then you've got the Giants, who are kind of hapless year over year, and you never know. And then you've got that terrific football team from Washington. You never know what you're going to get with them. So they play those guys twice. And so, again, I'm with you, though. Looking at the early season is huge. So not only is the Eagles someone I target in a normal league, but looking at this year, they start against Washington. Sign me up. That's a perfect spot for me to take someone in the last round of my draft. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I agree with that sentiment. I think with almost every home league or most leagues that are just general redraft, you're going to see those defenses go early. You'll see the Bears get picked in the 9th round. And I'd rather have the player all day, because I know that you're wanting that defense, but no one thought last year the Patriots defense was going to be the top end one, because everybody just thought that, it was going to be the Bears again, or it's going to be this again. And you just need to keep looking at who's going to be the next one. And like last year, the Steelers were the pick to have towards the end of the season. And they're one that now, is there any defenses that you would look like? Let's say the Pittsburgh Steelers ended up being there in the 13th round. Their current ADP is the 10th round. Would you look to grab them there, or would you still just hold off, get those high upside players?
Well, okay, so the only time I would take a defense before the last round is if you're in a keeper league, like I was talking about before, where you get a keeper with that round. So in my mind, I'm looking at it like, all right, so I'm not going to keep the defense, but that gives me later rounds to then draft players that I can keep next year. So there's a benefit to drafting a player in the 15th and a defense, right? That's the only time I'd switch that. The other thing I would say is, as much as I would love to understand how defenses work year over year, I have yet to find a way to be sticky about it. You hit the nail on the head. The Bears were supposed to be the defense last year, right? And then they weren't. Before that, it was the Jaguars. Remember that? Jaguars were the stud defense, and then they weren't, and the Bears showed up, right? Every year we do this to ourselves in fantasy where we think we know, right? Remember the Ravens were like the best defense of all time, and then they weren't, and it was Minnesota. So to me, there's no benefit. You're losing out on so much value on your bench where you need it most. There's no value to taking a defense, even if they're the best defense or the best kicker in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. There's just so much value left on the board. The points over replacement, like the value against the person you'll pick up on the waivers, is 1 to 2 points. No, give me the 7 to 8 point differential for the running back or receiver versus who you pick up on the waivers. It's a no-brainer to me. And I love being in home leagues where I see guys draft them in the 10th round. I'm like, heck yeah, all right, more value for me, right? And I love when you see a run go. That's my favorite. There was one league, I'm in like I said, a home league for a long time, and there was a year, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, we had 4 defenses, I think, drafted in the 12th round, because somebody took one, and then somebody else said, oh, nuts, that's who I wanted. Well, I'll just take these guys instead. And then somebody said, oh, that's 2. Oh, I guess now I got to get one. And so it just pushed so much more value down to the rest of us. And in that league, not everybody is out. A lot of us know fantasy, know what we're doing. So it just so happened to get kind of lucky to see some of them in a row like that. And I loved it, because I'm not going to say you shouldn't do it. I just feel like you're going to hate yourself later when you go, well, at least I got the Baltimore defense and they got me 7 points, but I passed up on a guy like, I don't know, Damian Harris, who could be the starter. Like it's embarrassing in a way. Like, just think it through, man. Take the defense off waivers. You're going to be fine. Play the matchups. You'll be even better.
Yep, I agree. I can't say it any better. And with kickers, just don't draft one at all. Just pick them up later. Or I think it's hashtag boot the kicker season. So think about getting rid of the kicker, add another flex. I did that in my home keeper league, and it's been a lot of fun because it just makes it to where you have to have a little bit more depth. And it makes it to where those floor guys are a little bit more important, and the ceiling guys are also important. So think about adding another flex, because I look at I know a lot of us are in dynasty leagues, and we have like 10 starting spots, and that's doesn't even include kickers, defenses, and I'm not in a dynasty league with kickers or defenses. So also, if you really like defenses and you are against getting rid of team defense, go to IDP. There's a whole world with IDP. It's scary, I will say, but there's so much people on Twitter that just talk about it and are really helpful, actually. So yeah, I'm more against team defense as well, and I think going to deep IDP is going to be more beneficial. But I will say I understand not wanting to spend your whole life looking at fantasy football, because it gets hard. It's hard for me on just the offensive side, and the defense makes it a little bit tough too.
Oh, for sure. And I want to say this too. I'm the happiest I've been in my 20 years of playing fantasy. This is the first year I don't have a league with a kicker. Finally, the one league that still had it isn't going to happen this year because of COVID, and so they decided to take the year off. It's a work league, and I get it. The other one that was just before that was my home league I've been talking about. They finally did the same thing you said. We switched kicker to flex last season, and everybody loved it. There was no complaints about it. So exactly. And I think what that does, like you said, it adds a little bit more skill. It also makes it so the draft means a little more. Instead of guys taking kickers early and all that, just get rid of them. Let them take another player and see if they're really as good as they say. I mean, kickers, while there is some predictability to that, and I'm not going to get into that, down that rabbit hole and into that field, my logic is that there is a place for kickers. I just don't think it's in fantasy. I just don't. If you're going to do kickers, why don't we do punters? You know what I mean? Like, well, that's in the league, right? Why aren't we doing head coaches? That's in the league. I mean, just where do you draw the line? Well, kickers aren't offense. Yes, they score points, but that's not the same thing. It's just I'm fine with booting the kicker. I'm fully on board with that.
I'm trying to get that hashtag trending, but a lot of people don't like it. So we'll see if it can be trending eventually. But let's go to move to in-season waiver moves and trades. How do you spend your fab during the season? Do you look to conserve fab or start spending right away?
So I guess it depends on a lot of factors, and I hate answers that start with that. But the easy way I put it is I try not to spend more than 50% of my fab before week 10. And 10 or 11, somewhere in there. And when you're starting to see if you're in the playoffs or not, if you're in the playoff hunt, you want to have fab in weeks 12, 13, 14, 15, if your league allows fab in the playoffs. You want to have fab there, especially if you're in a home league or something where guys don't pay attention. They may end up spending all of their fab early. They may not spend any of it at all. I mean, we've all been in leagues where I think last year, somebody spent all of their fab on Darrell Williams in week 6. And that did not pan out, right? And the next highest bid was like 10% of fab. Right. So my logic is always spend what you feel comfortable doing, but save half of it for the last spot in the season. If you're, I don't know, let's say by week 10, you're 2-7 and you're heading into week 10, go nuts, man. You got to go for the world, spend it all. Right. It depends on your league. It depends on your players. It depends on who you have, who gets hurt. But generally speaking, I'm a little conservative out of the gate, unless it's a no brainer. I think it was last year or 2 years ago, Gus Edwards was one of those guys that sort of showed up. Everybody thought it was going to be Alex Collins, and he just didn't do anything. And Gus Edwards showed up in like week 7 or something. That's someone you'll hear everybody say go all in on fab on. And if you're listening to podcasts like yours or others, you'll hear a lot of great advice throughout the season, week to week, to know when to do that. But as a general rule of thumb, I try to save it. I think that there's certain players, but for general, let me save it for later when I need it more.
Yeah, and we're going to go into finding breakout players, and I think that's an important part with doing waiver wire is finding those. But one thing I do want to say real quick is that if anybody's still just doing waiver priority, get that changed immediately. Go to fab. It's just 1,000 times better because anybody can have the player. And I know that's the argument for auction versus snake draft as well, which auction is something I actually want to get into more because I mainly have just done snake drafts. They're a little bit easier on my brain. And auctions are a little bit uncomfortable, especially the fast auctions. I did one, and oh man, it's stressful because then you're bidding up and you're like, how high am I going to go? And then someone keeps bidding, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to go a little higher. And then you both go a little higher, and then you're like $20 out of 100 over what you want to spend. And it's just an adventure. But yeah, try fab out. It's definitely worth it. You can do like $100 of fab, and then people just bid on it throughout the season. If you ever have any questions, you can reach out to me, reach out to Andrew, anybody, and we'll help you out because it's the way to go. So next question is, how do you find potential breakout players on the waiver wire? Do you look at stats like snap percentage, or is there more watching them play on the field or a combo? Like one example is like 2018 Nick Chubb. So he was someone that everybody was talking about. He's someone actually I ended up grabbing the league and obviously trading him away. And it was, I think with him, it was sort of trying to look at the tea leaves a little bit. So what do you look for, Andrew?
Sure. So, I mean, for any position, really, I mean, what you're looking for is production, right? And when you only have 1 week, like after the first week, there are going to be a ton of guys that are on waivers that we had not planned on drafting and that were not in our rule books, and none was ranked back in March in the guide you picked up, right? That happens every single year. So the first week is always crazy. I always say to people too, the first week is the only week where the rules don't matter, right? Just do your best, figure it out, and try from there. But after that, weeks 2, 3, 4, you start to have more data points, and you can start to see, like you said, snap percentage. I like to look at targets more than anything for receivers anyway. If you're looking at a receiver, even if let's say he gets 1 catch on 6 targets, okay, he got 1 catch on 6 targets for 8 yards, right? He's not going to be somebody that's showing up high in the weekly points, and everybody sorts by that to see who got points last week. Points aren't predictive like that. Targets usually are. If an offense is targeting somebody, you can usually say, hey, they're getting some looks in that offense. Somebody's calling plays for them, and it just didn't work out that week because they were getting guarded, or they slipped on this play, or the quarterback threw a bad ball. I mean, there's a million reasons. So I like to look at targets, and then for running backs, what I do is kind of the same, I guess. I like target running backs. Any running back that gets a pass is worth more than a carry in general. So what you end up doing too is if there are players, I think there are guys even like this year that are going undrafted, like Jalen Richard is somebody who is not going to be drafted. I'm not going to pick him up, but I could easily see me putting him on my bench at some point in the season just because he's getting 6 targets out of the backfield. Well, that's something, right? If he gets that kind of production, if he's getting that kind of look, maybe that upside is worth holding on to see if he blows up. Right. And so a lot of times what I use my bench for is for guys that are pre-breakout. Right. So I'm trying to go even deeper because you can always look at the waivers and then sort whatever site you're on. You can sort by how many points did they score last week. That's all fine and dandy. But if you got one guy, and I've seen this happen every year, one catch on one target for 80 yards and a touchdown. No thanks. I don't want that guy. That is a fluke. That is a definite person that you are going to be sad you drafted. If it's the same with a running back, we see it. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was like a running back that had like a 60-yard for a touchdown 2 or 3 years ago. And everybody in my home league was like, we got to go get that guy. And I was like, it was one run. Like, he just got lucky. Like, go for it. Have at him. Darrell Williams is kind of one of those too, where he was the heir apparent because the guy went down. And I'm like, there's no proof of that. Like, why are we risking everything on it? So like some of that stuff is just sort of paying attention, really. I don't know how else to put it. Just look and see how the points were scored, and if your league allows for points for first down or points per reception or anything like that, those matter more. So pay attention to that too. But I mean, yeah, it's always going to be tough to find a breakout, but there's nothing better than when you get it right. Oh, love when that happens.
Yeah, and targets is a fantastic point because, like, I think with tight ends, that's something that is overlooked a ton because someone that I really like this year is Irv Smith Jr., and he's going to be on the waiver wire in almost every redraft league, and I think he has potential with BC being the wide receiver 2 right now to sort of step in and be more productive. And if he explodes week 1, then obviously you're going to have to spend a ton of fab. I actually have debated in my own mind. I still haven't decided if I want to use him for my 15th round pick. But it's one of those things. Yeah, look for those targets, look for the snaps. One thing that I like to do is look at the running backs who are the replacement backs, like especially going into the playoffs. And I'll go to jump to this point, like going into the playoffs, if you have someone like a Jamison Crowder that you know is not going to see your lineup after bye weeks, drop him immediately. Grab yourself like a Duke Johnson, a Latavius Murray, someone I really like as well. Just anybody like a Tony Pollard, Alexander Madison, Chase Edmonds. There's going to be a couple that just show up that we don't even think about yet. Boston Scott is another example. And like load up on him. That's what I did in last year in my work league. And I had 5 people that everybody's like, oh, dude, they're scrubs. Like, why do you have them? It's like, dude, if anybody goes down, I am set, like beyond set with this league. So yeah, just look for those guys that you think can make the jump.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. I think once buys are over and you don't have to worry about that anymore, you don't need to worry. Your lineup is your lineup unless an injury happens, and then you're going to need a guy to step up big anyway. So I'm with you. There's no point. I do that every year. After the last time I have a buy, like if my running backs are buys 7, 8, 9, 7, 7, 8, 8, 9, or whatever, you know what I mean? Like week 10, I'm dropping those guys that I don't need. Unless they're a potential starter or a flex play, of course, but like backups and handcuffs, I'm dropping those guys I don't need as much. The potential, like the Sony Michels, right? I'll drop Sony Michel for Alexander Madison. Sony's not going to see my lineup no matter how hard I try. Even if something breaks out, I'm still going to feel horrible clicking yes on that box, right? So it's like for me, I'd much rather have the Tony Pollard, the Alexander Madison, guys that will get drafted that will be dropped, right? This happens in redraft all the time. Guys will get drafted, like Tony Pollard, for instance. Let's use him. Let's say it's even the Zeke owner. They'll draft Tony Pollard in the 10th and think, I'm locked up. I got him all year. Well, then bye weeks come in week 7, and they got to make a decision. Who's the first guy to go? Tony Pollard. So he's going to see the waivers at some point during your season. It's almost a guarantee. Same with Madison, same with Murray, those guys. So that's when your buys are over, you can start shedding some of that weight. The guy, like you said, roster fodder, like Crowder, even Cobb, guys like that are kind of in that mid-range that you're just like, meh, I don't need depth anymore. I need potential upside even better. At the same time, when it comes to running backs, I always try to get, like you said, try to get more of them because you're going to need more running back depth as the season progresses. We see it every year. Receivers get hurt. Running backs get hurt more. And so what ends up happening is you get a running back like James Conner or something and goes down. And then you got Jalen Samuels last year. Well, McFarland is a prime pick this year. He's not going to get drafted, guaranteed. But in week 10, if somebody is dropped, whatever, you've got players that you don't need, somebody's dropped McFarland perhaps, or he's just on waivers, I say pick him up, right? He's a prime case for something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I really have nothing to add to that. So we sort of jump into playoffs with what you do to prepare your teams. And one thing I was going to say as well is with defenses, especially, is look towards those end of season matchups. And even with trades, if you know if your team's 8-1 and you have a player like let's say you have Christian McCaffrey, and I don't know his end of season, but let's say his end of season is really bad. He's been playing really well, but like Saquon's matching him stride for stride. And Saquon has a crazy awesome end of season schedule. He's facing like the Washington football team and maybe the Bengals and the Panthers or something like that. Like last year, that's Saquon had a super easy strength of schedule at the end of the season. And I ended up trading for him in one league, and it actually helped me win the whole league. I ended up beating in the finals by like 80 points. It was insane. But anyways, just sort of looking at those matchups, and especially with quarterbacks as well. Like I dropped Josh Allen in so many leagues last year in 1 QB leagues because his matchups got awful at the end of the season. And you look at the points, you're like, oh, he'll be fine, this and that. And it's like just matchups are so much more important. And like you already said, Andrew, there's more data points. So you know who the good defenses are and you know who the bad defenses are.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on that, there's no reason to do that now, right? There's no data now. So I'm with you 100%. There's no reason to do that now, but that's exactly when you do it is week 10, 11, 12, and you start shaping your team up. I can't tell you how many times I picked up a defense in week 10 to ride my bench and not use them until week 12, 13, 14, when it starts to matter. Like New England last year was one of those guys. And obviously everybody had New England by then, but they were one of those teams that had a great end of season, right? And so there's a bunch of that. If you can get a week or two early and you can kind of beat the waiver wire to that guy, if you can pick up Chase Edmonds in week 8 before his bye in week 9, and then they make a decision as a team in week 10, Drake is hurt. Like he's in a boot now. So who knows if he makes it. And then Chase Edmonds comes out. Some of that stuff can really blow up and help your team. So I'm right there with you. At the same time, when planning for playoffs, yes, defenses and kind of opposing defenses, I guess you would say it, matters a lot. But I also like to look at grabbing not only your own handcuff, of course, but other people's handcuffs. And that's where I also like to take kind of that same idea the other way, where it's the 2-for-1 back, where I'm giving away one to get two. Sometimes that can be helpful, like I said before, where if you've got your stud, but you're like, well, the drop off here isn't much, but it adds a little bit of running back depth for my playoff run. That might be something you look at, as in week 2, you might not have done that. So it's always about knowing the context, knowing your league and everything like that. On the other end of that, something I've done too is if there's a guy on the waivers that I really want, but everyone on my bench is someone I want to keep, I'll do a 2-for-1 and open up a roster spot via trade and get them that way. So it really just depends on what your team is looking like, what your league is looking like. I mean, if you're scrapping to the playoffs and you're like 5-5 and just need a win, then let's go get some wins, right? Let's not worry about the playoffs. But if you're 9-1, well, okay, you can start to kind of coast. You can start to look at things a little bit bigger. So I think all of that context comes in real handy. And at this point of the year in August, there's no way for us to know that, right? So just ask us on Twitter is what I always tell you. Ask me. I'm always open. I know you are too, Jacob. It's like, well, let's just talk about this. We don't mind. So reach out. We'll help you out throughout the season for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if your league's like a start 3 wide receiver league and the bench is, okay, so 15 teams, probably start 8, so 7 people on the bench or something like that, maybe 6, then I would only have 4 wide receivers, especially if you're more top heavy, which I would expect by the middle of the season. And every other roster spot is going to be a running back or maybe one defense, maybe. And I love the idea of stacking that defense, sort of looking ahead. And that's like the Steelers last year is the prime example. In one league, I was able to get them early. In the other league, I sort of was like, I'll wait a little bit. They aren't as on top of it. And I didn't get them. I ended up not getting them. I was super sad because that was the one time I debated on trading for a defense. And I know it's a scary thing, but it gets wishy-washy because, as we've already mentioned, it's hard to predict defenses 100%. I know we get more data points, but I don't know. Patriots defense I wanted to make a trade for, but I couldn't do it.
Defenses, like team defenses in fantasy, in my mind, are one of the, I don't know, I want to say the worst. That sounds bad, but like one of my least favorite parts, because there have been so many times that I've lost a week by 2 points because the defense scored 30. You know what I mean? Like they just happened. Like New England last year had one where it's like 2 touchdowns received or interceptions returned for touchdowns. They're like they let up 0 points, and so there's a bonus for that in this league. And it's like, are you serious? Like they got 30 random points from the defense, and they lost by 2 points. 120 to 118. Like we both put up stellar weeks, but 30 of their points. On the other side of that coin, we've all won those weeks too, right? Where we all randomly get that boost. So that's kind of why I like Dynasty for the most part. I'm only in one Dynasty league that has defenses, and it's with it's like a home Dynasty league. It's a bunch of guys that just don't want to get rid of it. And I guess that's fine, whatever. But for me, I just don't like that randomness in there. And as much as people want to say it's not random, and I get the logic of it being somewhat predictive, those big boom weeks happen to anybody. I'd rather remove that and have it be a boom week from a flex guy. To me, that feels better. I'd rather lose on a 30-point week to Jamison Crowder than a 30-point week to, I don't know, Tennessee defense. It's like, what? Who had that predicted? Like, there's no way that was like, nobody ranked them number one, right? Like, it happens every year. So I don't know. My personal thing with defense is kind of to close this up, and playoffs especially, is don't be afraid to move them. Don't be afraid to pick them up, even if they're the number one defense. I think it was 2 years ago, I had a team that was pretty solid going into the playoffs, and it was the number 2 defense I think I had on my team, and I dropped them for the number 7 defense. And somebody swooped in and picked up the defense I dropped, and I forget what teams they were now. But the number 7 defense had the best postseason schedule, and I won the league. So I'm telling you, like, some of that stuff, don't be too, like you said before, take lock. Don't be too lined up with the rankings of the past. Look at the future. The future is where you're going. The playoffs are where we're all going to be. If anybody listens to your podcast, they're going to the playoffs, right? So we all want to be on this together. Let's all focus on the future and winning that championship. That's all that matters. You don't get to die with a pretty corpse, right? You don't get to, hey, I ended the season. My team had the best team and I came in third. Nobody cares, right? You don't get the championship. You don't get the trophy. That's what it's all about.
Yep, I agree. And talking about defensive scoring, actually, there was a article that I found that I may post this on Twitter, actually, and it was how to improve your defensive scoring. And the premise is that the defense starts with 0 points, and the defense gets points for doing stuff like sacks or interceptions or anything like that. So a couple examples are the defense, they don't get a negative point until they end up doing below like the league average or something like that. Like they don't really get hit hard. So this is for sleeper, I'm pretty sure, but it was like interceptions, they get 3 points. Then they get like a point for forced fumbles, a point for fumble recovery, a point for a sack, 0.5 for tackle for a loss. It depends on your site for what you can customize. But then like for 0 points allowed, it was 0. For 0 to 99 yards allowed, it was 0. And they didn't start getting negative points for yards allowed until they hit 300 yards. And then same with points, they had -1 for 7 to 13. And then once they reached 14 at -2, and it got worse from there. And it made it to where the like Patriots defense was not like the Patriots defense last year scored as like a top 12 option, which is such a crazy advantage for something that, like you've already mentioned, it's all it takes is just one crazy year and one crazy thing. And with this defensive scoring, it made it to where most people, like I think the Patriots averaged like 16 points per game or 15 versus they were averaging like 20 or even higher.
It was nuts. Yeah. I mean, there was some, I've seen some trades in redraft leagues last year for the Patriots, like 1-for-1, like Patriots for Cooper Kupp. And I was like, wow, okay, that's a bonkers trade, right? But the guy who had Cooper Kupp had 4 other stud receivers. And so it's kind of wasted on his bench. So that's, again, I keep hitting on this, but like context is everything. Right. And I can't tell you, I know you and I both, we interact a lot with people on Twitter, and there are people that tag us and things, and they say, who would you rather have, X or Y? And I almost always ask, well, how many starters do you have? Is it PPR or not? Like, is it a dynasty league where everybody trades a lot? Because I'd rather have the value in a league where everybody trades, but I'd rather have the stud starter in leagues where nobody trades. And so like that context gets lost a lot in those tweets because you only have so many characters. So my general advice for redraft, to kind of circle all back around, and even defenses and everything, do what makes your team better. Don't do what makes Twitter think your team gets better, right? Do what you think makes your team better. There are so many times I've made trades that on paper make 0 sense, but for my team, that makes perfect sense. Like it doesn't matter what the people say. It doesn't matter what the value is. If I'm getting a stud guy in a position that I need a stud guy, right? If my tight end was Delaney Walker and I limped through the season, but by week 10, I'm just hurting, and I overpaid for Kittle, for 2 guys on my bench for Kittle, worth it in a heartbeat. They're not getting me points. Kittle is, right? So like, all of that stuff comes to play. I wish there was a way we could ask people before we get tagged, which is impossible, to say, what is the context of this? Give me the reason for this. I don't want to just have you win a Twitter poll and say, hey, slam dunk, I win. Like, it's not always that easy. And I think, too, especially when people go from Dynasty back to redraft, which a lot of us do, because we all have redraft as our base, it can be really hard to say, I won or lost this trade, because we're all used to Dynasty values. And so I see that a lot too, where people are overvaluing rookies in receivers and tight ends in redraft all the time. And guys that I play dynasty leagues with, when we're in a redraft together, you know, those redraft guys are always taking running backs early. That's their MO. That was my MO when I was only redraft. Now that I've switched to dynasty, I've noticed that my receiver knowledge is a little bit higher. I tend to take guys that I think have more upside, like Henry Ruggs, for instance. I would be happy to have in dynasty. He might be my wide receiver 1 or 2 on a dynasty team. In redraft this year, especially, there is a lot of question marks around him. You get 1 year. You're not looking at the long term. I am looking at right now. And sometimes it can be hard to put those blinders on as a dynasty player and say, let's look at just this year. What is Henry Ruggs' value? I honestly don't know. He could be wide receiver 30. He could be wide receiver 300, right? We don't know. Same with like CD Lamb. We don't know. There's not a lot of preseason. We're not seeing guys in pads take the field and play against each other. There's been a whole lot of weird stuff happening this year, right? Off the field and outside of football. I think all of that adds up. And I think this year, especially, more than ever, running backs are going to get the ball because that's what running backs do. Receivers are probably going to take a while to acclimate because that's what they do. And tight ends are going to take even longer. Luckily, this year we didn't have any like stud tight ends like last year with Hawkinson and Fant, who kind of entered the league and everybody got hubbub about. There weren't a whole lot of like obvious picks, but you're going to start to see guys like your Irv Smith pick. I think is a fine one. It's his second year. He's learned the offense. They've changed a little bit, but he understands how to acclimate now. That first batch is over. He's ripped off the Band-Aid. Now he's learning more. So second year, third year guys, I am entirely fine with going all in on, unless the offense or they have changed teams. Something crazy has happened. But rookies, except for running backs, I'm very hesitant on in redraft. And in Dynasty, it's the opposite. Give me all the rookies. You know what I mean? I want all that upside to grow on my team. You only have 1 year in redraft. You got to put them to bed at the end of the year and go start again. So you don't get any of that benefit if they blow up next year.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like one example for me was with Scott Fishbowl. The ADP was all sorts of crazy because there was rookie drafts going and the ADP wasn't different. So I used the Fantasy Pros cheat sheet app and I just crossed people off as they were drafted so I could see who the top end redraft guys were. Because in my mind, I know like you mentioned Henry Ruggs, like most people would probably be like, oh yeah, Ruggs above Crowder, why not? But Crowder in a PPR league is 10,000 times better than Ruggs for this year alone. So yeah, it's a great point. And that's where like getting the rankings, printing them off, doing your tiers, doing that way. And you may have little bits you want to do some errors like, oh, I like this guy more than that guy. And that's fine. But find some way that if you're mainly dynasty, get out of your head. Go to the people with – that's why I like listening to the Fantasy Footballers podcast because they do a great job with redraft. And that's what they focus on. And I know we on Twitter think we're so smart. We know exactly what's going on. But I'll admit for redraft, I am not as prepared as last year. Last year I listened to like Fantasy Pros, the – Chris Harris podcast, I think was what it was called. And then also the Footballers. And I listened to all three of those podcasts and I actually had some fantastic drafts. But this year, I've been focused a little bit too much dynasty. So it's going to be a little bit rough.
Well, and I can tell you this too, at PFN, we do a lot of both, right? So we've been doing dynasty for this whole off season, since January. A lot of what PFN does is a lot of the draft and Devy stuff. So that's kind of where we live is those college to NFL transition. We got a terrific NFL draft room, an NFL draft team that writes about scouting reports and all this. And it's actually really given me a big edge in my own research because I have inside info to some of this and I see what we publish because I'm on the site and I'm part of the team. So I get to see all of these things that I didn't get to see last year. But at the same time, in our fantasy team, we have shifted very heavily to redraft in the last couple of weeks. So all of our stuff posted right now is, while it says Dynasty, we're very much redraft focused. And the large part of that is, like I said before, Dynasty becomes redraft once the season starts, right? Dynasty, yes, I get that trade values are still something you still need to worry about future, and there's future picks involved. But week-to-week winning is the whole reason we play this game, right? There's nothing worse than having a terrific team and going 1-11. Right? Like, oh my, what happened? You weren't playing the weekly game. You still have to win the weeks. Everybody should be win now. Redraft is always win now. That's the thing I like about it. And looking back, what I always loved about it the most was everybody at that draft is drafting for this season. They're all on the same page. Sometimes what you get in Dynasty is you get 3 or 4 teams that kind of, I don't want to say opt out, it's kind of the term, but they say, I'll just draft players later and I'll go for rookie picks and I'm just going to tank and productive struggle year 1. And you don't get that in redraft. There is no year 2. It's all right now. So I think sometimes a lot of us in Dynasty, we forget that it is still a weekly game. Something that is on PFN is Philip Caldwell has his consistency score, and it's something I highly recommend. I think consistency is something that gets overlooked a lot in fantasy. And so what he did is he looked at a way to make a way to compare everybody's numbers, everybody's stats week to week, and say who does best week 1 versus week 2 versus week 3. Who would be more consistent? Who'd be better on your team? And in redraft, that is key. That is exactly what you need, is somebody who is consistently putting up good numbers, not somebody that sometimes, like Amari Cooper, will put up 22 and then 0. You cannot win. It's hard, I should say. You cannot have a good chance to winning your team with Amari Cooper putting up a 0 in week 8. That's going to be hard to overcome. So if you can get guys that are consistent and guys that you can rank consistently as a starter for your team, you're going to have a better chance. And that's what redraft is all about, is just focus on the now. Let's not worry too much about this, that, and the other. And again, I say this a lot too. I'd much rather miss on a guy that blows up than be wrong on a guy that does nothing in my lineup. There's nothing worse than getting a 0 or 2 points for someone in your lineup because you thought they were going to blow up. I'd rather be wrong and have to get 20 points on my bench or someone else's bench or on the waivers. That's so much easier to overcome. Just play for now, look at the numbers, and you'll be fine. That's honestly the way it is.
Yep, I agree. Had a blast recording tonight. Andrew, do you have any projects you're working on right now?
So this Monday, I'm actually releasing the third in my series of mock draft Mondays, where I do a mock draft every week. I know that we're doing a lot of redraft content. I just put out an article on Josh Jacobs, why he's the perfect RB1 for your redraft team. I know sometimes people look at Jacobs as kind of like a second tier option, but it's like, no. You can get him in the second round. You can go receiver in the first, kind of antithetical to what we were saying, but you can go Jacobs with your first running back and be entirely fine. He's looking great this year. So I do a bunch of stuff like that. And I mean, in general, just keeping the content flowing for PFN. You can always hit me up on Twitter, obviously at Andrew Hall FF, and then at PFN Dynasty, so that we can always try to help you out and try to win your league. The whole thing with PFN is trying to win your team, win your league every week, and just get you that ship. That's the whole point.
Awesome. Thank you again for coming on the show, Andrew. Everybody go and follow Andrew on Twitter at Andrew Hall FF, as well as check out the PFF Dynasty Twitter handle. So also make sure to subscribe, rate, and review to the Snake in the Draft podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and let's be snakes this draft season.